By starting with a quintessentially German style of watch, the World War II pilot's or Flieger watch, and mating Japanese sensibilities and manufacturing process, Orient has been able to make the Orient flight a truly unique mishmash. To appreciate how unique the Orient flight is, we need to not only appreciate some of the details of this watch, but also the company Orient. Watch collectors often regard Orient watches as the forgotten and perhaps neglected number 4 watchmaker in Japan. Now, their roots go all the way back to 1901, even though the Orient brand was officially named in 1950. And consistently, Orient has been a well-respected brand of affordable mechanical movements as well as solar movements. Presently, Orient is owned by the Seiko Group. Specifically, it's a subsidiary of the Seiko Epson Corporation, which is one of 3 companies of the Seiko Group. So technically, it's owned by Seiko. But my understanding is Orient, for the most part, retains its own manufacturing facilities, although it might share a few with Seiko, and it does manufacture all of its movements in-house in Japan. My experience with Orients, regardless of who they're owned by, is that they have a very distinct character from their Seiko brethren. With the Orient flight, the star of the show is definitely the dial. And what we have here is what's called a Type B Flieger dial. There were 2 main styles of pilots' watches issued to German pilots during the Second World War, and this style utilizes prominent tandem track of Arabics, prominently with the minute markers on the outer track, marked in such a way for ease of readability. This traditional pilot watch's layout has certain proportions that are very logical. The hour's hand reaches only to the inner hour's track, whereas the minute hand reaches to the outer minutes track. The second hand reaches all the way to the outer hashes, and so at each level of reading, you're able to ascertain immediately where the hand should fall. I say should because amongst many brands, this layout is very popular, and so proportionality is one very easy way to ascertain if the design has been well thought through. Despite adapting these German design tropes, the Orient flight is thoroughly Japanese, and it abandons most of the traditional Flieger watches specifications. For example, the 42mm case size on the Orient flight is actually a significant reduction from the original watches. Also, the case is not bead blasted as the original pilots were. The specifications on the case spec lend further to how this watch has become distinctively Japanese. First of all, it has 100 meters of water resistance, unheard of in these old pilots' watches. Furthermore, it has an automatic movement, another feature that would have not been found on the original watches, which were hand winding. So we can see that although it adopts a number of German styles, is definitely not a strict homage in any sense of the word. Every aspect of the watch has Orient's own take on the watch, which I think is very fresh. This, of course, is all true with the case, but it's most obvious of all in the dial itself. To return to that, here we have the applied Orient logo with lions surrounding the shield and the crown. We have the Orient automatic water resistance 100-meter text, and this water resistance is principally achieved through a screwed case back and actually a screwed or threaded crown. This crown actually has a nice little inset for the crown. It's a wide, flat crown and sits nicely in the case, and while not having an inspiring feel, is very easy to operate. Now, this movement does not utilize any sort of hacking or hand winding function, and so the 2 settings are for setting the date and for setting the time, respectively. The feel of the crown in the hand is stable, and changing the time and the date is something that can be done with some precision. Now, you will notice that the movement does continue to run as you are adjusting the time. The seconds hand is going to continue to turn as you are adjusting the time, which means you're going to be somewhat limited on precision, but you can backwind the movement a little bit to get the movement to stop momentarily if you need to be really precise. Notably, Orient does use in-house calibers, and this 48743 caliber is a very basic 40-hour power reserve 21 joule automatic movement. As you can see, I think it's a sound decision to have a solid case spec on this movement, even though it is nice to have an automatic movement. One of the features that stands out on the Orient flight, especially in real life, is the raised and chamfered mineral crystal. The raised flat crystal is definitely a look that Rolex has adopted with great success, but on this model, because the mineral glass is more prone to chipping, I'm going to be concerned about the long-term durability of this raised crystal. It's definitely going to be the thing that's going to make contact with a doorknob or a wall before the cases, depending on the angle that you hit. These days, there's really a vast number of pilot and military style watches that collectors can get, and putting the Orient flight amongst other options that adopt different military styles, it definitely has a full feel is with regard to the amount of info on the dial. And at 42 millimeters, it really feels like it's a very average size, much smaller than, for example, the 46 millimeter Aviate Hawker Hurricane, which I just recently reviewed, and a little bigger than the Hamilton, which is still pretty much my favorite watch. I think what you would more specifically cross-shop with the Orient would be like a Seiko 5 military-style watch. Here we have the Field Watch, which I've previously reviewed, and here we also have an Aviate Flyboy, which is kind of a boutique watch alternative to the mainstream Japanese brands at roughly the same price. In this context, the Orient is definitely a more traditional choice, a simpler choice, but I would argue also a tasteful choice, and one that maybe a watch cognoscendi would be able to appreciate and recognize as opposed to the more common Seikos. Build quality with Seiko is pretty much neck and neck, and I would say that I prefer the brush finish on the Orient compared to the Seiko, but I prefer the Aviate's crown. I definitely prefer the solid caseback on the Orient over the other two watches. Both the Seiko and the Aviate don't benefit from a display case considering their simple movements. Please do me a favor and stay tuned, and please subscribe if you haven't already as I continue to roll out the reviews of some of these military style watches. I will be doing a standalone review comparing these watches in depth once I'm done with all of the standalone reviews. On the wrist, the Orient fits very comfortably on the wrist. It's well proportioned with its 22mm lug width and 42mm case height. The caseback is wide and flat. It's a very reasonable footprint, and as you'll notice in this picture, the lugs themselves are not very long. What's loomed on the dial is typically good for a Japanese watch, although notably the second hand does not have loom. The two setbacks to this watch in my mind are the non-loom second hand and the poorly executed date aperture, but at around $150 price point, you can really set those things aside and appreciate this Japanese interpretation of a very traditional German style. And what's interesting is as stolid as the design maybe was originally, this watch is actually pretty fun. I'd appreciate your thumbs up if you made it this far, and I definitely would appreciate your subscription if you haven't subscribed already. Thanks a lot for your time.